Good evening, everyone. And for those of you who are joining us just this evening, welcome to the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. My name is Neil Peris da Costa. I am Associate Dean of Research here and also have been working together with a wonderful team of people to organise and present this third Global Piano Roll meeting. And we've had a wonderful day so far today, and we have the crowning glory of the day, which is an Alfred lecture series concert. Before I talk about that and introduce our guest, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are on Gadigal country here, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and this is a very special place where the Gaddies have sung and danced for millennia and have exchanged knowledge and have, through their songs, provided training in language, in culture, and their histories. It's very important. And their lands were taken away from them. They didn't cede their lands, that were taken away from them during colonialism, and their culture was pretty decimated. And so these days in Australia, we try to acknowledge that, and we try very hard. We're trying very hard at the University of Sydney and in this institution, the Sydney Conservatorium, to make it possible for more Indigenous people to come and work here and to share their knowledge. And they have such extraordinary knowledge of the land, particularly, of waterways, of songlines. They can actually solve problems that modern technology can't solve. It's really quite extraordinary. So it's very important that we engage with their culture, and I find the Sydney Conservatorium a really great place where we're doing well with that, and we can do better, but we are doing well. So I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their ancestors and their elders past, present, and those who are to emerge. We also do a lot of research I'm just going to say a few words about this, in Indigenous musics, and one of the things we've been doing a lot of here at the Conservatorium is reimagining how Indigenous corroboree songs might have sounded from the fragments that we have left of white settlers writing down what they heard when they arrived in the 1820s, 1830s. And it's been a really amazing, eye-opening thing for me. I've worked in historically informed performance for a long time, and what we do is piece together the fragments of the past, all bits of jigsaw puzzle, and we have to use our imagination to fill in the gaps because we don't have all the knowledge. And that leads to all sorts of wonderful creativity. The same is true of Indigenous music. We can, through various wonderful processes, look at these transcriptions of original corroboree songs which were written down as parlour music with piano accompaniment, and with the expertise that we have in linguistics and other forms, we can actually extract the melodies and reset it in what it might have sounded like, or what it's likely to sound like compared to what we already know. And the benefits of this are that the cultures that this music belong to, the countries that belong to, get to have some of their music back in a different format, albeit, but they can go on in a new way in the 21st century with their culture. They relearn their knowledge. They have something to grab hold of and to rebuild, and that's really amazing. But it's the same as HIP. This is what I wanted to say. We are using fragments of the past to reimagine how these things could be effective in our society in the future. And it's in that spirit that I want to announce what the Alfred lecture series is about. So, Alfred Samuel Hooke was a practicing architect who believed architecture, like music, was an art vital to people's prosperity. And he helped found the University of Sydney's Faculty of Architecture in 1918, from which he retired as Dean in 1949. Hooke's other great love was music. He gave lunch hour talks on the history of music, illustrated by the university's collection of gramophone records, so it's pretty apt that we have this as part of our meeting. He was a member of the university's choral group and, as a keen organist, was associated with the installation of the university's War Memorial Carillon, which we heard from Grace Chan about earlier on today. And he founded that in 1928, and also founded, importantly for me, the Department of Music in 1948, and that's the department that I did my undergraduate studies at over on main campus. Some of you may not know that Sydney Conservatoire of Music was a separate institution to the University of Sydney until about 25 years ago, at which point they were amalgamated. And so the Con has become the School of Music, and we have this is our satellite our campus here, but we also have a lot of teaching and research going on main campus at the Seymour Centre. And soon also at the Footbridge Theatre. We have a music theatre course starting there. So that's very exciting, and there's a lot of expansion. But in the old days, when I was going through university in the 80s, they were separate places, and they were kind of in battle with each other. That's what I'd like to say. Quite a few of my colleagues are here tonight who were at the music department, and the SCM was a bit of a no-go place. We didn't come here. People here learned how to play, and people over there learnt or created knowledge or learnt knowledge. And none of that was true, actually. The knowledge was everywhere, but we had this kind of faction going on. And so it's really great that we don't have that going on now. Anyway, the Alfred Hooke lecture is made possible through a generous request from Doreen Robson. And so it's my great honour to introduce Professor Clive Brown, who really doesn't need any introduction. I'm not going to go through his biography because mostly people know who he is. And one of the extraordinary things that he has done is produced his monograph, Classical and Romantic Performing Practice, I should say, which is about to come out in its second version, enlarged with a huge amount of research undertaken over the past few years to expand it, and so many insights. I've read a few parts of it. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the fact that I met Clive by chance, by accident in a way. I had finished at the Guildhall School of Music in London, and I was waiting around thinking I want to be a professional forte pianist and harpsichordist in London. And some agent decided that they would kind of throw me a few, chances. And so I remember, and I was with Danny, and we're living in our flea-bitten apartment in Finsbury Park with no money between us, and suddenly I got a phone call saying, get on the next train from King's Cross up to Edinburgh. The Edinburgh Festival needs you to play the forte piano. You're to meet a man called Clive Brown. I'd never heard of Clive Brown. And so I did that. I got on the train, got up there, and Clive met me. And of course I was, I thought, wow, what a curious man. He looks curious, he's wearing a bow tie. But he also had a pile of books about this high in his hand and literally got off the train and gave them to me and said, you need to learn all this music in 4 days. The festival performances in 4 days' time. It was horrendous, I have to say. The program was called Salieri and Friends, as I remember, and
Friends and Enemies.
Friends and Enemies, yes. and the program was all the most virtuosic music that Salieri and people he knew had written, variations and all sorts of things, which I had no way that I could have learnt that in 4 days. So I pretty much had a nervous breakdown. But we got through the 4 performances, just about. And I remember at the end, Clive bought me a bottle of whiskey, and he also used to take me out. He took me out on day journeys out to castles around Edinburgh and stuff to try and distract me from the horrendous experience I was having with playing. And I think we became, first of all, very good friends during that process, and drank the whole bottle of whiskey over the days. But also, we started talking about early recordings, and I expressed an interest in studying or finding out how Brahms's music was played, because that was one of my passions. How I didn't believe it was played in the way that I had learnt when I was here in Sydney. And I had some inklings because another friend of mine had said, you need to listen to Joseph Joachim playing. There are some wax recordings, and we didn't have any way then of finding those here. I mean, we didn't have the internet and all that. And then Clive reiterated that to me, you need to listen to early recordings. So we had a few discussions, and then eventually he called me and said the University of Leeds, where he was then positioned, had opened up some scholarships for PhD students. And I took the opportunity, and he said, come and do this PhD. And that has really launched me personally on this extraordinary journey. And for about 5 years, or 6 years even maybe, it was a long time, wasn't it? I travelled up from London to Leeds to be with Clive and with his wife Dorothea, and they welcomed me into their home. But extraordinary times that we had talking about music and talking about performance practice and talking about the evidence. And one of the things that we really, I suppose, got so excited about to bring it into what we are doing here at this meeting, which is looking at piano rolls, is that we discovered this disc of Reinecke, Leschetizky and Saint-Saëns on the Arcaphon label. It was that one, and I bought it at Tower Records in London, and it advertised it as being the closest possible connection, something like those words, to the 19th century pianism. And when we listened to it, I think, to use an Australian expression, we were completely blown away because we had not envisaged hearing the sorts of things we were hearing on that Weltermignon roll emulation recording, whatever you want to call it. And that has really spearheaded such a journey with this. I feel so privileged to know this man. And I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah. It's wonderful. It's a great pleasure to be here in Sydney again, and I owe a lot to Neil as well over the years. He's already told you quite a few interesting things about reconnecting with the past. I want to focus on a couple of these, sort of one end and the other of this. On the one end, we've got the historian's way of connecting with the past, really looking at every scrap of evidence, trying to make sense of it. On the other, we have the people who use the past as a kind of tool for achieving something specific, and they are very selective with how they use the past. This happens in music all the time, but it also happens in politics, of course. Politicians can never be trusted to represent the past as it really was. It's how they wanted it to be. And this does happen in music too, in a kind of political way. In 1966, the Austrian government established an institute for the study of Wiener Klangstil, the Viennese sound style. They wanted to show that Vienna really was the place where the traditions of the great composers were retained. And for instance, here's a little extract from their writings. There is evidence of string schools from the Viennese classical period to our day being taught by the concert masters of the great Viennese orchestras, who passed on the musical tradition from master to pupil. Well, they don't exactly say it, but the implication there is that they're playing music just as it was played in Beethoven's time, which, of course, is a very dubious thing. But when you look back at the history of these things, you find that change has always been happening. History is not stable. There isn't something that was an established style that we can all pick up on and perform the music just as it was performed in those days. Even if we wanted to do that, we couldn't do it. Already within 20 years of Beethoven's death, we have Carl Czerny, his pupil for at least 10 years and his close friend for the rest of Beethoven's life, writing this. In the performance of Beethoven's works and those of overall of all classical authors, the player ought absolutely not to permit himself any change to the composition, any addition, any abbreviation. That's the beginning of a movement that became more established during the 19th century, that these great masterpieces of art must not be tampered with. They must be played exactly as the composer wrote them. Actually, Carl Czerny, in Beethoven's lifetime, made ornamentation in his music with Beethoven's approval. Beethoven certainly expected it. He would never have dared to do it if Beethoven didn't expect it. Beethoven's fury was well known. So he's now, 20 years later, giving us a rather different story. He's changing his mind about these things. And then he goes on to say, even if it were possible to reproduce his way of playing exactly, it could not, in relation to current levels of skill with respect to clarity and precision in difficult passages, always act as a model. In other words, Beethoven didn't always play all the right notes, and now we expect people to play the right notes. And even the spiritual conception has acquired a different validity through the changed taste of the times and must now and then be expressed by other means than were necessary in those days. So there was no stable notion of this is how Beethoven should be played. It was being changed gradually according to the taste of the times. And that has always happened. Taste is always changing. In the 20th century, we have the same kind of thing being said, but from a different angle. Here, Karl Flesch is not concerned with gradual evolution, he's concerned with revolution. And yet he uses some of the same language as Carl Czerny. He talks about the spiritual angle of the music. He says, in relation to Louis Spohr's works, which were getting less and less popular during the early 20th century, that if we want to recall Spohr's compositions to life again, we must employ present-day means of expression in their reproduction. I'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. It is only that which is essential, the Spohrian spirit, that we must try to save and carry over without injury into our own time. Well, Flesch tells us that we shouldn't use Spohr's fingerings because they're not the right sort of thing for nowadays. We shouldn't use the kind of bowing that Spohr used, and Spohr marked all of these things in his music because they're not modern. But we should retain his spirit. So what is the spirit if it's not what the composer actually imagined the music should be played? But there we are. The 20th century was full of these kinds of things. Karl Flesch here tells us that in the past decades, all the arts have undergone tremendous changes. So it only seems natural if musical interpretation is influenced and adapted to contemporary feelings. Van der Landoska, famous harpsichord revivalist in the early 20th century. If Rameau himself would rise from his grave to demand of me some changes in my interpretation of his Dauphine, I would answer, you gave birth to it, it is beautiful, but now leave me alone with it. You have nothing more to say, go away. So the 20th century way of doing it was much more important than anything historical. Artur Schnabel, who was one of the first important pianists to insist upon playing his hands together unless the composer marked an arpeggiation, he would gently mock the hands apart style. He felt one could be equally expressive playing hands together and would say so with a twinkle in his eye. And then a really good example here, a letter to the Musical Times in 1925. Modern modes of expression imperatively demand modern methods of voice production. Vocalization follows the law of progress in common with other arts and sciences. The law of progress, that's the most important thing for those people. Move on. Knowledge. What is knowledge about these things? Well, when we look at the performance of medieval, Renaissance and Baroque music, we have a number of sources we can use. We have music notation itself, we have writings about music, iconography, pictures, organology, the instruments. We also have mechanical instruments which can play the music for some parts of this of that history. But there's very little evidence, really. There's a great deal of guesswork involved in trying to recreate a style for medieval, Renaissance and Baroque music, and we can never achieve that. We can never achieve any kind of reproduction of past styles because it's simply, we don't have enough evidence to do that. And even if we could do it, it's not really what we're aiming to do because we're looking for ways to liven the music making of our own day by using some of the expressive tools that composers and performers were expecting to be used in those times. So we have only a little evidence for this period of music. But if we go on to the classical and romantic periods, the periods of Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven, all the way through to Brahms and Elgar, we have a great deal more evidence. We have treatises and encyclopedias, journals and newspapers, autobiographies, memoirs, letters and so on, musical notation, manuscript and printed, iconography, mechanical instruments, piano rolls, acoustic recordings, all of those things. We have a huge amount of evidence. So for the first period, we've got too little evidence, and for the second period, we've got too much, because it's overwhelming. But we can look a little further here at how we might use that knowledge. We can use intuition, we can use experience. And what do we come to here when we think about this? We've got notation, which is associated with the composer's intentions. But the composer's intentions for what? Certainly the composer's intentions for the notation, because composers are very concerned to write down their music in the way that they wish it to be conveyed to the performer. But for the performance, we've got something which I like to think of as the composer's expectations, the things that go beyond notation, that are not possible to reproduce in notation, but which are essential for creating a beautiful performance. In fact, in the early 19th century, there was a strong concept of richtiger Vortrag and schöner Vortrag in German writing, correct performance and beautiful performance. And the two things were different. The composer's intentions for the notation fits with the former, with richtiger Vortrag, correct performance, and students had to learn how to play the music exactly according to the score first, and when they could do that, they then had to use beautiful performance. They had to listen to great performers and find out how the music should actually be interpreted. So when we look at the modern concept of the urtext, which is something that has really become more and more important during my lifetime, we have to ask us, what is the urtext for? We can look at some, even quite modern editions, even from the 21st century, to find out what people thought about this. One of them, a Max Reger string quartet, is full of instructions. And yet, Max Reger's contemporary Mahler, desiring a slight slowing of tempo, would write nicht eilen, don't hurry, or for a subtle speeding up, nicht schleppen, don't drag. Nevertheless, he was continually frustrated. One would almost be tempted to write in no tempi and no expression marks, he said, in exasperation, and leave it to the performer to understand and articulate the music in his own way. So even if you put masses of instructions in the music, as Mahler did, as Max Reger did, you have to decide what those mean, and it's not an easy task. This, if it were there, is almost completely devoid of any marks. No instructions, no staccato marks, no anything really. And the performer was expected simply to understand how that should be done. But towards the end of the 19th century, people were very conscious of the distinction between what the notation shows and what the performer was expected to do. Here, Artur, writing in 1880s, a musical work of art does not function like a machine, the parts of which can be illustrated in their nature and their musical interaction through words and pictorial signs in the most precise way. It's more like an animated organism whose largely unpredictable living conditions cannot be measured precisely and thus not symbolized by visible signs. It's a wonderful description of music, I think. Even the most perfect notation, if it was simply reproduced correctly, would only be able to arouse a very approximate picture of the composition in the listener, since it must omit much that is absolutely essential for the composition. Now, in my opinion, what is usually termed the art of execution consists in apprehending and carrying out these necessary deviations, this rubato of manifold variety, which, of course, is to be read only between the lines. And we find many 19th century writers about music talking about reading between the lines because they were so aware of this distinction. Now, in a way, with these urtexts, we're on the horns of a dilemma because an urtext edition doesn't tell us anything except what the composer's intentions for the notation were. And this has often been confused with the expectations for performance. So here we have, in an anonymous text edition, I won't identify it any further, our aim has been to integrate the insights and knowledge of an editor with those of a violinist to form an edition that addresses the needs of performers today, and in particular to assist an ethos of performance closer to one Beethoven might have recognized. Well, we could probably agree with all of that. We would not advocate adding more slurs, as in some editions, which do not conform to Beethoven's intentions. Now, that becomes a little bit more problematic. How does he know that they don't conform with Beethoven's intentions? He doesn't, of course. And then rather ambiguously, the fingerings are within the framework of present-day playing techniques. So we won't use historical fingerings, we won't use any slurs that aren't marked. This is the piece that the previous man was talking about, Beethoven's Violin Concerto, and this is a copy of an edition, the first edition, used by Ferdinand David, born in 1810, so well into Beethoven's lifetime, and it probably relates to his first known performance of the concerto in 1834, and it's full of markings which are added to Beethoven's text, because Beethoven, who was very careful with his chamber music, in his solo display music, so the piano concertos and the violin concerto, he writes much less information. Why? Because the performer was expected to be free with these things, and it wasn't the business of the composer to give those kinds of details. So he's got lots of different fingerings and lots of different bowing. And if you look at the fourth line down very carefully, you can see little TR markings. He was adding trills. He was adding ornamentation to Beethoven, the thing that Czerny was to condemn in 1846. So we move on. I'm moving on to the early music movement now, because we have been trying for a long time to understand the past. It's happened in my lifetime. I was unaware of the early music movement when I was young, really only in the 1970s that I began to become aware of it, and it was exciting at the time. People were doing different things, and here we have, they used to call it authenticity, and the word became a dirty word during the 1970s and 80s. And here we have a nice little, from the Punch magazine, a little bit of visual wit involved with that. Grove's Dictionary of Music, which was published in the fifth edition in 1980, had an article on performing practice, which didn't believe that we would easily be able to go beyond the Baroque into the 19th century. From that article, it was almost insuperable obstacles in the way of our performing Beethoven's symphonies with the instrumental resources available to the composer. Well, within 2 years of that article being published, there were recordings of Beethoven's symphonies beginning to come. What were the priorities of the people who did this? Moving from the Baroque into the classical period. The instruments have always been the big thing with Baroque performance. Getting the right instruments was the major thing. There was also things like the correct execution of ornaments, the use of vibrato in string playing and in singing and so on, and issues of tempo, of course, particularly for dances where we have evidence in the 18th century. But instruments was the really important thing. And I was involved here, I gave a lecture at this Berlioz experience of Roger Norrington in the Queen Elizabeth Hall in 1988. The New York Times, commenting on it, said Mr. Norrington's Berlioz was not prissy and polite. It certainly wasn't. It was very vigorous. It was as vivid as the composer's memoirs. But ultimately, it was the sheer sound of the Berlioz orchestra of the 1830s that struck home. So the people who were going to these things were excited by the sounds of these old instruments. I can remember the serpents and the other strange instruments that Berlioz used, and the sound of them was really exciting. What about the performance? Well, it was pretty straight to the text of the composer. Maybe it should have been, but there was nothing much beyond that in terms of performance. And because it was an enormous orchestra, they had to get in lots of players who were not from the Baroque tradition, but were modern players. And I can remember seeing people with shoulder rests and even steel E strings mixed among the violins because they needed so many of them. That was the least important thing for them. Tempo becomes important here. Let's listen to just a few bars of Herbert von Karajan's performance of the second movement of Beethoven's First Symphony. As you can see, the tempo marked by Beethoven himself is 120. you've got the idea. You can hear the tempo. And now the first period instrument performance by the Hanover Band in 1982. Let's listen to a little bit of that. Seems to be exactly the same, doesn't it? But that's what we're listening to. The force of custom in these things, that's how you expected to hear this movement. And the Hanover Band did it exactly at the same tempo as Karajan. It wasn't until we got to Roger Norrington in 1986 that we got something different. Okay, now another issue that begins to become important here, certainly to me, because this is something, as I'm a violinist, and so one of the things I really wanted to try and do was to understand how they actually played the instrument in those times. Everybody plays with a very modern style, like this, and this is just as true of people playing on period instruments as it is of people playing on modern instruments. It's something that started during the 20th century. You can see the things that I wrote about this at the time because it was, for me, something very important. More recently, I've been doing more work on it, and here we have some pictures which shows you the difference absolutely clearly and where it comes from. Because the very first one is Carl Flesch's 1923 treatise on violin playing, and you can see he has the correct way, which is his way, with your elbow up here, and the incorrect way, which is with your elbow down here. And then we look at the 19th century ones, from 1890 there. It's much closer to the one in the middle, and the one there from 1835 is very clear that it's a totally different position. We go to the other end of the bow, and we see Carl Flesch wants you to play like that. And he tells you it's faulty to play like this. But then look at the correct ones on the right-hand side there. They are definitely what he calls incorrect, and the faulty ones, which are demonstrated by Leopold Mozart and Charles de Berriot, are very like what Carl Flesch was doing. So these issues became very important to me. And there's a whole chapter about it in my my classical and romantic performing practice, which you can see there, also with the cover of the new edition, which is out in around November, I think. There's an issue here, which is that the people who perform are very talented musicians, but mostly they don't do historical research. Or that was true of the past. It's less true. There are far more young musicians now who are interested in this and are doing fabulous things. But at the beginning of the 21st century, Christopher Hogwood here makes the point very clearly that scholars and musicians are either extremely well informed in regard to musical theory and the score, but have relatively poor skill in instrument playing, or by contrast, practice 8 hours a day but know almost nothing about related knowledge. This results in a division between theory and practice. So one of the things I set myself to do at this time, in the round about the beginning of this century, was to institute doctoral studies which would deal with those things. So practice-led research into historical performing practice. And some of the people I've worked with here, at the top of the list is Neil, who was a pioneer in all of this with his piano studies. But he did a straightforward musicological doctorate, because we didn't have anything else at the time. Performance, of course, was really important, but it wasn't included as such in the doctorate. David Milsom on the violin, George Kedaway on the cello, all of those people were doing the musicological doctorate. Then we began to institute a kind of doctorate which could include performance as part of its study. It's still called a PhD because it was really using the performance as an integral element of the investigation and of the research results of these things. There's some productions here that have appeared since from all of those students, and you can see a selection of them there. Neil's book, Neil and I worked together with one of my other PhD students, Kate Bennett Wadsworth, on the Brahms sonatas for Bärenreiter. David Milsom has also published there. And I want to give you an example of the kind of work we started to do. One of the most important things, it seemed to me at the beginning of this, was the idea of emulating historical recordings. Because by doing that, you begin to free yourself physically from the practices that you are used to. Once you've done it, you can apply it to other repertoire. Here we have a recording by Isai of his own composition from 1912. So, first of all, the student, in this case Ilyas Devtsoglu, had to imitate as closely as possible exactly what Isai was doing. The use of portamento like that is totally alien to modern string playing. You simply don't hear it. So there are inhibitions to be overcome in order to do portamento at all. And here's what he did. So, it's a pretty good imitation of what Isai was doing. Having accomplished this and imitating other early recordings, he was then in a position to go and play works which were never recorded at that time, or not by the performers who were really from that tradition. So he could record the César Franck Sonata, which was written for Isai, and other works by Lequeux and so on that were from the same period. For pianists, exactly the same thing applied. This pianist is going to play a John Field Nocturne. First of all, I told her she should play it in the way that she was used to playing it. She was trained in I think, at the Nanking Conservatory in China, a very talented, very accomplished pianist. So I said, play it the way you used to play it. And she said, well, I'm not sure I can anymore. But she tried, and this was what she played. having done it in her modern way, which was very literal, beautiful but literal, she had to listen to Karl Reinecke. So, we move on to Miao Yin. So as you can hear, it's full of the same things that Reinecke was doing. It's very complicated to do this with these subtle dislocations between the two hands of the pianist. And once she could do that, she could apply that to Brahms, to Schumann, and made some really fascinating recordings recreating these practices. Towards the end of her research time, she came to me and said, I went to a concert by my old teacher. She had also had lessons in London. It was so boring, he just played the notes. So you see that these things get into your soul, and in the end you can't actually do anything else once you've learned this, once you've actually experienced this way of doing things. So what we learn is things like this, that unnotated rubato of various kinds is an integral aspect of fine performance, that short groups of slurred equal-length notes are often performed unequally into the early 20th century, that expressive notes are lengthened while surrounding notes are correspondingly hurried, that long short figures could stand for anything from more or less equal notes through triplets to overdotted figures, that improvised ornamentation has complex stylistic and technical issues which affect its changing use, but it's there a lot of the time, that expressive sliding and trembling effects, so portamento and vibrato, they're expected spontaneously from singers, string players, and wind players. That legato and articulation is only partially indicated by slurs and staccato marks. Many things happen that are not apparent in the notation. That vertical asynchrony is often expected spontaneously in ensemble and in keyboard playing. Now, I wrote quite a lot about this at the time, so we're talking now about the first decade of the century. And one of the articles I wrote was a review article. So it was reviewing recent CDs of historical performance, and most of them stayed very, very close to the notation, and really, I wrote a very hard-hitting review about this. Some people said I shouldn't publish it because it would make me many enemies. But I did in the end. And I found by pure chance on the internet this curious thing referring to it. The title, of course, tells you a lot. The yawning chasm between contemporary practice and historical evidence. And abandon hope, all ye who enter here. We got a huge grant for research in this area into old editions and what the old editions could tell us about things. This was called the Chase Project, and it was to create a database which is accessible online and is still accessible online. And some of the things we found were really fascinating. I had always wondered whether it was possible to find the copies that belonged to Ferdinand David. Ferdinand David, some of you will know anyway, but he was a great friend of Mendelssohn. He became the leader of the Gewandhaus Orchestra in Leipzig, and also the founding violin teacher at the Leipzig Conservatorium, and had very many fine pupils, including Joseph Joachim. We already had the violin concerto of Beethoven, which is now in the British Library, and there was a set of the Mendelssohn string quartets with David's markings as well. So I wondered if there was the possibility that others might exist. I knew that his son, Paul David, had become the music teacher at Uppingham School in England. And I thought it was worth the possibility to go there to see whether some of that music survived. And as it happened, there was a cupboard with quite a few copies that had belonged to Ferdinand David. He'd taken most of his music, Paul David, to Oxford when he retired there, which is, I think, where the 2 surviving copies that we had already had come from, probably from a sale of his goods when he died. But he'd obviously forgotten some things, and among them was this really interesting copy of Ferdinand David's edition of Mozart's duets for violin and viola, full of markings. And I just want to give you a little idea. We did an article for the Chase website about this, but one of my PhD students, who's a fine viola player and violinist, and we decided to make some recordings to see whether we could apply the principles which we had learned from all of this study to this music and to follow David's markings. You can see that he actually changed things in his own edition. So he didn't always stick to the first ideas that he had about it. I'll just play you the first 3 lines of this. We, of course, using gut strings and all the right equipment. I want to play you this one now in its entirety because it's a really fascinating thing. We were astonished when we discovered this. Ferdinand David had totally rewritten the viola part of Mozart's duet for his own use. And you can see from reviews that he performed from these parts, one from 1868. The duet for violin and viola, in particular, is a production full of the sweetest charm and most lovely grace. We need only add that the performers were deluged with the richest and most well-deserved applause, and that this time the arrangements were different because concertmaster David changed to the viola for the duo and quintet. And then this is the one which refers to David's own version. Then came a duo for violin and viola in B-flat major by Mozart, in the edition of the duets edited by David and published by Barthold Senf. A piece full of inspiration and loveliness, excellently performed by concertmasters Röntgen, violin, and David, viola, and received by the public with stormy acclamation. The adagio, with its continuous pizzicato viola accompaniment, even had to be repeated. So they loved it. It was Mozart's original is rather boring, to be honest, because the viola plays double stops all the way through just to provide a harmonic accompaniment. This gives it the character of a serenade. It's rather like in Don Giovanni, and I think it works really well. Here we are. Well, the priority there was to play it as we think David would have played it. And you heard a few little portamenti slides. You might think that that's probably not correct for Mozart. On the other hand, we do know that in the 18th century, a great number of violinists were sliding already. It was the new fashionable way to play, and I guess that Mozart himself probably used it. I regarded it as very important that I should work with my students in a practical way, because it's something that you need to do as a group, because you learn from each other. You have ideas and you're able to exchange them with one another. Now, because we had all this material by David, the Mendelssohn quartets was an obvious thing for us to work at. And we recorded, I think, 3 of the quartets using David's fingerings and bowings, and the fingerings are extremely revealing. I want to play you a section, not the whole movement, but a section from this movement as we did it. And you'll notice that we use very little vibrato. The idea of using vibrato as an ornament really survives into the 20th century. It's only the new generation at the beginning of the 20th century who really develop the modern style of continuous vibrato. Of course, the performing practice aspect was important for us in this, and we produced a number of articles on that, and as you can see, my concern with the physical properties of violin playing. I have to confess that in the recordings you've heard so far, I was still essentially playing with a modern technique. It's a scary thing to change physically what you do on a string instrument. And it's only in the things I've done more recently that I've really come to terms with reproducing as far as possible those physical movements. But one of the things I was particularly interested in, and also my string playing students, was the use of the portamento. Now, this is a wonderful source for understanding that. This is Charles de Berriot's Méthode de violon, in which he invented 3 different signs for different kinds of portamento, as you can see. So a fast one, a soft one, and a very dragged one. And I tried to demonstrate this in an article that I wrote in around 2010, I think it was. And if these are going to play, I will show you what this sounds like. Listening to music is actually the best way to explain things, because words are useless for explaining musical sounds and musical effects. You can only really appreciate them from hearing the music itself. So let's try one more time with this. So that ends elegy. One of the things that I've been very interested in over the years is to try and make editions, critical editions, which are urtext in one sense, but also with a great deal of performance information. And these are some of the ones that I've made. Well, I think it's probably more or less the complete list of the editions that I've made. Most recently, the Brahms sonatas with Neil and Kate Bennett-Wadsworth, and then the Beethoven violin sonatas last year, 2020, sorry, which we collaborated on for the online commentary. This is an example of the Brahms, and I was going to play you something of Brahms, but I think given the time scale now that I'm going to skip over that and move on. Yeah, I was going to compare various modern performances of this sonata. I'll just play you the very beginnings, yeah? So here's how it was being played in the 1980s by a famous pianist and violinist. And this is on period instruments. Listen to that. And so on. Notice that the chords are absolutely together in the piano part. Very, very few pianists are yet interested in using the arpeggiation that would have been definitely used at that time. In fact, the use of dots and a slur is probably Brahms's way of showing that he wants you to arpeggiate those, because this was a long-established practice, with examples going back to the early 19th century of that notation being associated with the use of spread chords. So that one was rather too fast, according to the historical evidence. This one is around the right speed, I think, but still a little bit slow. I think that's enough to hear the chords together. The evidence comes from early editions, many of them made by people who were closely associated with Brahms himself. Franz Kneisel played for Brahms. And you see that it's full of harmonics, these O's. These are stopped are harmonics played at the halfway point of the string, and of course without any kind of vibrato. And you see there's at least 5 of them on this page. We look at another edition by Schnabel, who was a pupil of Joseph Joachim, and Robert Kahn, who also knew Brahms very well, and we see the same harmonics. There's a tradition here. Another one here by Artur Seibold, who played under Brahms in the Meiningen Orchestra. And all of these have got the harmonics in exactly the same places. So many features which are consistent. We get to Carl Flesch's edition. Carl Flesch, you remember, is the great modernizer of string playing. And he gets rid of most of the harmonics. 1 or 2 of them remain. And you can see at the beginning he puts it in brackets because he recognizes it's the tradition, but he wants you to use more or less continuous vibrato. So he puts a fingered note. This is our edition, and you can see in the violin part that I've reinstated a lot of these old practices. But of course, to understand them is a different matter. I'll play at least a few bars of this one. I'll stop it at that point. This is something that appeared on the internet, violinist.com, best edition of Brahms sonatas. Somebody writes, puzzled, I'm about to buy sheet music for the Brahms sonatas and wonder if anyone here had a chance to compare the Henley and Bärenreiter Urtext editions. Ours is the Bärenreiter. Reading the descriptions at least, the Bärenreiter seems to come with both marked and unmarked violin parts. But the marked part is mentioned to have fingering and bowing based on the practices of Joseph Joachim and his colleagues. And while that may be interesting to study, I think it may be quite far from what is considered best practice now. And this one, I love this one. I recently played a Brahms sonata in a Bärenreiter edition, had to change 80% of the fingerings. They were just unimaginable to my hand and ear. They were written by a Baroque HIP expert who for some reason was editing a Brahms sonata. So that might have had something to do with it. And then the editor of the website writes, that's Clive Brown's edition. Just for the record, he's an authority on classical romantic HIP, and I'm sure extremely knowledgeable on Baroque. So you liking, disliking his edition is for another discussion. But just wanted to clarify the point. And then the most recent practice, the most recent edition that I've made is the Beethoven Sonata. Now, this is much more contentious. I'll have to be quite quick, of course, because we're overrunning a little bit. But it's quite contentious because people have a very fixed idea of how Beethoven should be played. So we've went to great lengths to make it as clear as possible what evidence all of the things we were talking about was based on. It's a very extensive essay that I wrote, 30 pages or so, of reading between the lines of Beethoven's notation with a lot of illustrations to provide the evidence for all of this. And we together made a performance practice commentary, which you can get online if you're interested, which is about 100 and something pages. Very recently, in September last year, I decided that I had to make some recordings in order to show how this actually transforms into practice. And if the machine works, I'll play you one, and that's the end of the talk. At the end of the example, I'm finished. I just wanted to show you some examples of the notation. You can see that I've also included little markings. These little things that look like crosses are to do with which part of the bow you might want to play in, because that's a fairly contentious issue. Point, the frog of the bow, so this end is the frog and this end the point. All of those instructions are given for people as an option to try it. I want to play you the second movement and scherzo, which follows, which is very short, of this movement. Now this is probably shocking to many people because it's full of portamento. Beethoven definitely used portamento with his colleagues. The violinist he worked with most frequently, Schuppanzig, is known to have used the portamento. So Beethoven must have expected in this music, but nobody nowadays would consider it appropriate in this repertoire. So I'll just play you this and you can make your own minds up.
Well, Clive, despite the technical hitches, which has nothing to do with you, and all these things happen sometimes, gremlins get in, thank you for sharing all of this years of work, absolute years of work, and reimagination and experimental performance. I mean, the thing that comes through is the dedication to trying new things. And I mean, why would we keep doing the same thing for the whole of our lives? It's been a wonderful journey for you. I would love you to say some words around where things are going now. I mean, for those of you who don't know, Clive spends quite a lot of his life now traveling to different institutions around Europe and other parts of the world, and really helping ensembles and individuals reform the way they play, giving them inspirational guidance. You haven't talked about Johannes Leotau's project. That would be very nice to hear about a little bit. Yeah. Where's it going, and what are you seeing in the world right now?
Well, change goes in fits and starts. You have periods of stability, and then you have periods of revolution. And I believe we are in a period of revolution. We've been building up to it over the last 20 years, and more enthusiastic young musicians are getting really interested in the idea that we should do something new and old with this repertoire, which has become, for many people, quite stale. We're trying to breathe back some life into it, and I find that there's huge amount of enthusiasm for that in the institutions I go to. The young people enter into it with great gusto. Also, there are many young ensembles, professional ensembles now, who are trying to do these things and really prepared to stick their neck out and risk the kind of criticism that they'll get from some quarters to enliven what we're doing with this music. I'm really very optimistic about the way that it's going forward, and I'm hoping that I live long enough to see it really to come to fruition, because it's a bit like the time-lapse photography of flowers opening, you know. You don't see it happening while it's opening, but over a period of time it really is changing.
Thank you. We might open up to... I don't think it matters that we're running over time. It's so fascinating. Let's have some questions, and we can continue the discussions outside as well. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you...
Wait.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I would like to know, when you played the Mozart for violin and viola.
Yes.
Yeah.
Would you imagine actually that in Mozart's time people wrote this also basically? It was just written more. That arrangement, you know what
yes.
you're talking about? Do you know what I mean?
The David arrangement. Would they have done that in Mozart's time?
Would have this been done also in Mozart's time?
I think in Mozart's time they had no conscience about changing the music that they were playing. They would have felt total freedom to do that kind of thing if they'd wanted to. And the cadenza, of course, was not written by Mozart. That was interpolated by David. Yeah. Ornamentation goes on in instrumental music well into the 19th century. And it's only gradually, with the kind of things that Czerny was saying, you shouldn't change a note of it, that by the middle of the century it's died out, and they think it's no longer appropriate.
Wait.
Check. This is on. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know if I can explain this well, but how far testing? Yeah. How far can performers go to not alter, but to give their own interpretation? How far could they, for example, come not out of time, but extend that sound? Is it to the taste of the audience, or is it to what they're feeling?
You have to bring the audiences with you. If you give an exciting performance where there's such commitment that the audience can appreciate that, most of them will go with you. The people who are problematic are the critics, And I've read some very stupid criticisms over the years, but also the system. Because, for instance, one of the things that the students will often say to me when they've been doing these things and they really get into it is, oh, but when I go for an audition, I can't do it like that. I have to do it the way I was taught. So those things change much more slowly. And the competitions, for instance, the judges on the competitions would probably push people out in the first round who played notes out of time as they would see it in the way that you heard in some of those recordings.
Some questions over this side. I think Sebastian has one just there next to you. Okay.
Hello. Clive, just wanted to ask you, in your travels, when you're trying to spread the word about this different way of trying to do things, what do you find in terms of the resistance? Are there different kinds of, shall we say, categories of instruments that are more resistant? I would have thought with heavier instruments like the cello, particularly some of the double bass in the string category, for example, just because the physical effort of playing those instruments is so much kind of greater, they might not be as nimble and you might be able to express yourself a little more with a violin, which is more agile and lighter, rather than the heavier string instruments, which might, in a way, condemn you to playing a little more closely to one particular model because of the, effort and lack of, I would say, just the size of the strings for one thing.
Yeah. No, I don't think there's any problem at all about that. I've had cellists who are just as agile and as willing to try these things as anybody else. The biggest problem for most people is that they can't any longer work out an interpretation which they can produce every time they play the piece, because that's totally outside the feeling of that time. You have to be free. You have to be willing to take chances. When the viola player of Joachim's quartet was interviewed after Joachim's death, he said it was damn difficult to play with the old man. Always a different rhythm, always a different tempo. And that's an issue for people. They have to be very confident that they can be free in those ways.
And just a quick follow-up question. Have you inspired other categories of instrumentalists, not string players, to also take chances? Have you seen that happen?
Yes. Singers and wind instrument players, yes, certainly. They're equally interested in this, if they're the kind of people who want to be interested. And there are many, many young people who are coming up here, and I'm learning from what they do as well, because very, very talented young musicians who have read the information and have been inspired by it to do exciting things.
I think, did you have a question? What? That's fine.
Thank you. I hope this is not too provocative. I just would like to ask, do you see a risk that this interest that you mentioned in doing something differently and doing things, and changing things, this revolutionary attitude that you have diagnosed, that this also conflicts sometimes in the sense that with our intention of a historically informed approach towards distinct repertoire, in the sense that this doing something differently is overemphasized in the sense that it is used more for a personal expression, and that it opens a bit some gates towards an let's say an anything goes attitude of applying these things. Yeah. Do you think there is a certain risk for that, and where do you draw the line and say, well, this is kind of going going away from a reconstruction of historical styles, but just employing bits and pieces of what we have there in an arbitrary manner.
Yeah, I don't worry about that at all. Because if you look back at the history of performance, there have always been people who have pushed things beyond the point at which the majority thought was appropriate. There have always been provocative people, and provocation is sometimes a very good thing. But I think that the mainstream people have enough musical sense to see what the evidence justifies, and yes, they will use it, but they may push it too far sometimes, but these things are usually compensated over time. So I don't have any real worries about that. I mean, there will be things that happen that I don't like, but that doesn't matter.
We do have one more question or two. Are you worried about the catering? Are they running off?
Hi, I would love to hear about your thoughts about the relationship between Beethoven and the metronome and the significance of his tempo markings.
Oh goodness, I think that's enough for another lecture. But I mean, I think they're a good guideline to what was in Beethoven's mind. Composers, when they fix metronome marks, are not always realistic about performance, but they give you a very good idea. Some of Mendelssohn's are so provocatively fast that you think it's nearly impossible, but he just is telling you, play it as fast as you can. So yes, I think I can't really go into more detail than that, but I trust them sufficiently to find them a useful guide, though some of them are wrong, of course. I mean, there's the famous one in the Ninth Symphony, which gets everybody to play the trio section of the scherzo about half as fast as it probably should be played, because it was just wrong in the source.
Thank you.
Thanks, Clive. I was wondering how the work you've done more recently with historical postures has changed how you think about the expressive devices, and has it made it easier or feel more natural? And certain things like vibrato, which are quite fast like we hear in these recordings.
Yeah.
How do you kind of go about learning that kind of historical technique that we don't really even teach, that super narrow vibrato these days, and how do you kind of learn that?
Okay, again, it's quite a complicated question. I mean, the only one in which I could say that I really had gone far enough was in the last one, the Beethoven, because even at my advanced age, but I have really tried hard. And do you know what I've discovered? That playing like this is actually very stressful. And I used to get pains in my shoulders. Since I've started to play like this, which is how they taught, I have had no physical problems. And I think this is a really, really important thing for young musicians, that actually this is a natural way to use your arms, and actually it makes things easier. I found that to playing these, especially these long legato passages with this relaxed way of playing, actually was easier than the old way. So, and the vibrato, well, everybody has their own way of doing vibrato. I haven't had a big problem to change my vibrato at all. Yeah, so.
On that note, I think we do have to stop because we have caterers here. Clive, despite the hiccups, I think everyone here gained a huge amount from your wisdom and experience, and we're looking forward to the release of the new book at the end of the year, I believe. Yeah. So watch out for that, everyone. And we're just thank you so much for coming all the way from Vienna to give this talk. And we're going to enjoy wine and refreshments and canapes outside now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.